Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. For our first segment, we will be discussing several unfolding world events. The United States has unveiled its new embassy in occupied Jerusalem as Israel has opened fire on protesters in Gaza once again. The ceremonial opening of the embassy stands in stark contrast to the violence being leveled against Palestinians across the country, which has continued largely unabated between Palestinian Land Day on March 30th, Nakba Day on May 15th, and the present. Later, Maduro has been reelected as the president of Venezuela with 67% of the vote. Venezuelan elections have been monitored by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of international observers, and the Venezuelan electoral system has been described as one of the most transparent in the world by many commentators, including former President Jimmy Carter. But the U.S. largely refuses to acknowledge these certifications. Instead, most U.S. media has taken a fringe right-wing elements of the Venezuelan opposition at face value. What is at stake for Maduro and the PSUV as they continue their process of trying to stabilize the country after right-wing attacks and crippling U.S. sanctions? To talk about all of this for the next half hour, we are joined by Abby Martin, host of the Empire Files on Telesur and co-founder of the citizen journalism project Media Roots. Thank you, Abby, for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
So let's start with Palestine. We've seen so much going down with the move from the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. What's been sort of the latest there? You've been to Gaza several times. Can you tell us a little bit about what the latest there is?
Well, I was actually banned from Gaza. I spent a month in the West Bank. The Israeli government banned me from going into Gaza because they said I was a propagandist, not a journalist. The actual press minister himself called me an Iranian agent. I thought I was a Russian agent and a Venezuelan agent, so I was confused about how that worked out. But that's what they do. They prevent people from actually going and seeing one of the world's gravest humanitarian crises. What's amazing to me is, this move to have the embassy the day of basically the genocide and this mass ethnic cleansing, which is the day of the Nakba, the catastrophe, which was already planned from Palestinians who were protesting week after week. So to have the embassy moved on that day was kind of an extra slap in the face, I think, to a lot of Palestinians. And then to obviously have Trump and all of his family egregiously say what a great day for Israel, the same day that 62 unarmed protesters were essentially executed by snipers sitting 100 yards away behind a border fence. These are unarmed protesters. They had people in their sniper scopes who were children that they decided to pull the trigger. 19 medics were shot. One doctor was killed. A doctor who was on Democracy Now!, his name was Tarek Lubani. He says that they were hiding in a medical center, and every time that they would even move and try to get people to help procure medicine to them, they would get a sniper fire just immediately on them, and so they were crawling. I mean, it was just the most horrifying massacre, right? And it's on video. It's on video where we're seeing amputees, people marked clearly pressed, shot and killed. And the fact that the world can just turn a blind eye, and you have Nikki Haley up there at the UN saying that Israel actually used the most restraint. I feel like I'm living in an inverted reality. I mean, I just can't believe what is going on, and the fact that not the entire world is up in arms in horror and pulling out their ambassadors from Israel. I just am speechless, Brian.
The IDF, I remember, this was some weeks back. This is before the latest attacks, but this has been during this entire series of protests. IDF put out a tweet saying, "We know where every bullet landed," and something to that effect, where they were bragging about how precise they were, that they know where every bullet landed, they know every person they shot, and obviously so much of that is bravado. But I actually, it seems pretty clear that they are that they're at least to some degree correct. They know they're targeting civilians. They know they're targeting journalists and medics for this sort of terror, absolute terrorism.
There's snipers who are very well trained with a wide view of the demonstrations. When people there's so many mental gymnastics going on. I mean, unlike the previous wars where Israel just unleashes a horrifying bombing campaign, in 2014 they killed 500 children alone in a couple weeks. Unlike those where there's kind of this fog of war and Hamas is shooting rockets and actually is attacking some IDF soldiers where a lot of them did die in the last assault, right? This is so clear cut of a massacre of unarmed protesters. We're talking about 35,000 people out of 2 million people who are trapped in this open air prison, this ghetto that's basically just a living Holocaust. And the fact that 1,300 people were shot with live ammunition. Some of these were dum-dum rounds, which is these exploding bullets, which basically shreds your bones apart. A lot of these people don't have to have amputations, but of course they are because they're not allowed to travel to get help. But on top of that, the mental gymnastics to justify this egregious massacre, right? One of the most egregious massacres that's ever happened in the history of the world, I think, especially the fact that it's on camera just makes it even more beyond the pale. The mental gymnastics about Hamas did this to themselves. I mean, I can't even think of a more dehumanizing group of people other than maybe ISIS. I feel like not even if someone were Nazis would this be okay to just execute people just because of a political affiliation, and that's giving the benefit of the doubt that they were Hamas. We also know, obviously, children, medics, press, right? And of course, we know that Israel just declares everyone in Gaza as a Hamas target. They have purposely, deliberately targeted journalists before. They bombed the Al-Sharif Journalist Tower back in 2012 during Pillar of Cloud, and they said, we absolutely knew there were journalists in the building. Everything in Gaza is a Hamas target. And you have IDF generals out there giving space in the Washington Times, Wall Street Journal, basically saying everyone fell for it. Everyone thought this was a peaceful protest. Well, you fell for Hamas propaganda again. And you have Barry Weiss, this sadist, on Bill Maher, actually has the audacity to say they planned this massacre themselves so they could have a side-by-side meme of Ivanka Trump at the Jerusalem embassy smiling next to dead kids. Yeah, they planned this massacre. Guess what? Every person had to be in the scope of a sniper. So whose fault is that? Even if Hamas, let's say, benefit of the doubt, even if Hamas was telling people, go to the border, the snipers still executed these people. I don't understand the disconnect here of blaming Hamas for snipers who were executing children, press, and medics, Brian. It's quite astounding. And the fact that people just mindlessly regurgitate this propaganda. I mean, the clashes, right? The media coverage saying people died in clashes, passive voice, acting as if everyone just kind of dropped dead from a foodborne illness. You have the front page of the New York Times the day after this massacre saying Israelis reflect. I hope that at least every bullet was justified. This is the kind of news coverage we're getting. I honestly thought that maybe something would change with this latest thing, but it just shows you that basically client states of the U.S. empire can do whatever they want, commit whatever war crimes they want, and we're just going to continue to cover up for them and block any sort of accountability, Brian.
I wonder who is even still believing this now that there are other outlets that people can go to see what's going on. I feel like so much of the media is facing this kind of crisis of legitimacy, where they're having to really clamp down on everybody who kind of dares to speak out. But I wonder if it hasn't backfired and whether this is actually working.
You're absolutely right. They have a multi-million-dollar, tens of millions of dollars going into this massive Hasbara, this explainer, right, of how to explain Israeli propaganda. They've been relying on this propaganda apparatus forever. They've been relying on the charge of anti-Semitism leveled at people who are simply criticizing the Israeli state. I mean, to basically claim that Israel represents all Jews is an anti-Semitic claim in itself. That's outrageous, and I think people are waking up. You see polls. Liberals have flipped their entire stance on Israel because you can't hide, as many cartoons and CD-ROMs that Netanyahu wants to throw out there to levy behind all these absurd charges of human shields and whatnot. You cannot deny and you cannot discount these photos and the videos that show unarmed people getting massacred. And not just that. I mean, that's just the Gaza protests. We already know, there's protests going on in Jerusalem, Haifa, where people are getting brutally beaten, arrested. 40% of all men living in the West Bank have served time in Israeli military prisons. Again, it's worth mentioning that people in the West Bank live under brutal Israeli military law. You can't stand in more than 5 groups of people. You can't hold up a Palestinian flag. Political parties are banned. Organizations are banned. This is the way it is in the West Bank. In Gaza, people who say, oh, well, why did they go to the protest? They know that it was deadly. Look, we're talking about people who are living in a concentration camp where 97% of their drinking water is contaminated with raw sewage. I can't even think of another place in the world where you can't even leave as a refugee. Otherwise, you'll get executed by Israeli military guard posts who won't allow you to go a certain number of yards beyond, as a fisherman. They have 4 hours of electricity a day. I mean, it's just so unbelievable that people don't understand the state of even what Gaza is, where 2 million people are essentially trapped in here. And again, back to your point about this propaganda apparatus, they are losing grip. They are losing grip, and all they really have is the corporate media as their weapon and tool to continue to just basically think of us all as morons, right? People who can't see with their own eyes about what's going on. And that's all they have to hold on to this narrative and continue to try to preemptively criminalize BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, organizations, groups, initiatives around the U.S., where you have in Houston, Texas, for example, you can't even rebuild homes from the hurricane without signing a waiver saying you will not boycott Israel. That's how bizarre it's gotten in this country, but that shows you how much they're running scared. And even though the political establishment, the media establishment laid down like a carpet for the war crimes of this apartheid state, independent media has taken up the charge, and they're filling the gaps, and people are waking up more like they never have. And I don't think this is going to last much longer. This fascist apartheid colonial settler state is just going to get more fascistic as time goes on. Netanyahu really does represent the true face of Israel. The left has fled. There is no hope from within. We have to support BDS to have one state with equal rights once and for all.
Yeah, I think you really hit on something there, which is I think we're nearing the end of where the Israeli settler colonial project can go. As these settler colonial projects unfold, I feel like the U.S. has unfolded that settler colonial project has unfolded over such a large amount of time that it hasn't it reached a certain level of completion and but there's still so much left to go there. Whereas with Israel, I think because it was such a small area to begin with, that their entire goal was to conquer Palestine. Obviously, they've also pushed into neighboring countries, Jordan and Syria. But I think it's nearing the end of where Israel can actually expand. And I think we're in a much different time where the settler colonial project, hopefully, I hope, is no longer as viable as it used to be.
Absolutely, Brian. And I think a lot of people are confused about holding on to this idea of a two-state solution. And I was too, to be frank, until I actually went to the West Bank and saw with my own eyes how the land is actually already divided into A, B, and C areas. And basically the illegal settlements, again, illegal under both Israeli law and international law. These are all illegal settlements that are in the West Bank, and they just continue to be built with the complete impunity of both Israel and the U.S. Government. But these settlements are taking over at such a rapid expansion, and especially with the Trump administration, they've just skyrocketed because they know they can just get away with anything. But they are seizing up and taking over those last tiny, tiny little pockets of what would have been the remaining Palestinian state. So the people who say, oh, what about the two-state solution? They don't understand that there actually is no state left for Palestinians. It has all been taken over by these settlements. You would literally have to go between guard posts to another checkpoint between settlements to even get to the next pocket of what is deemed even Palestinian villages still. It's unbelievable. So that only until I saw that did I realize, hey, there is no possibility for a two-state solution. And that's obviously beside the point that Israel never really wanted a two-state solution. They want full control. They want to completely take over and completely, basically ethnically cleanse all Arabs. Like you said, from the foundation of Israel to today, we're talking about Ben-Gurion's words himself, the first prime minister. He said, we need to expel the Arabs and take their places. They always knew there was an indigenous population. It was never a land without a people without a land. It was always overrun by an indigenous population that needed to be removed by force and by violence. And that is still going on today. It is still going on today, and it will not stop unless the rest of the world stops it.
Yeah, I hope we're at a point where we can now finally start thinking, instead of that two-state solution, instead to be thinking of a one democratic state that occupies the area currently that should be known as Palestine, from the river to the sea, that we can think of that in terms of, instead of this kind of false two-state solution that has been used to justify every kind of Israeli expansion. Oh, we're working on a two-state solution, we're trying to fix this, but for now we'll have this kind of status quo. Hopefully we can start, people will start thinking more in terms of what would an actual democratic state in historic Palestine look like, as we've discussed on the show many times before. So I would like to now kind of shift gears, and since you are have also done so much reporting within Venezuela, I'd like to talk about the Venezuelan elections that occurred recently, with Maduro winning 67% of the vote. All I have heard today is absolute pessimism and absolute unsourced criticism of the Venezuelan electoral process, where they simply say, many claim that the Venezuelan elections are not legitimate or whatnot, but there's never really a source put to these besides the Venezuelan the kind of far right wing opposition of Enrique Capriles. It doesn't seem like there's really anyone who's criticizing that. It's simply sort of these unsourced allegations.
Oh my God! I mean, Venezuela is. It infuriates me. Like, as much as the Palestine stuff is just beyond the pale, this is just outrageous. I mean, the coverage of Venezuela is comically bad. You just have all these corporate news journalists just literally just blindly regurgitating what opposition figures tell them. Whenever they do go to the country, they will just paint this cartoonish depiction of, everyone's starving and everyone's eating rats and dogs and there's cannibalism, and it's just a complete mess. It's like The Walking Dead, where all the supermarket shelves are just completely empty. And then when you have people like Vice going there, they just glorify these Guarimba frontline protesters who, and I can get into that in a second, but that's really also upsetting, because they never actually interview these people and say, what exactly are you doing? Why are you burning down these buildings? Why are you, throwing Molotov cocktails at food distribution warehouses and maternity clinics? They never really do that. They just kind of glorify them and paint them as these cool revolutionary people. But the election is also very hilarious to me, because they have so many elections, right? They have more elections than I think almost any other country that I know of. And the PSUV has won overwhelming ground in basically almost every election. I mean, discounting basically when the opposition took hold of the National Assembly, I think in 2015, and they essentially stalemated the country. For an opposition that claims that they want democracy, they seem to prefer an undemocratic way of actually carrying out their rule in the entire country. I mean, back from 2002, when they actually tried to carry out a coup, they did carry out a coup, which immediately the U.S. recognized, right? That was the only time the U.S. recognized results of Venezuela since Hugo Chavez won in 1999, is when there was a coup. But since then, I mean, you have Leopoldo Lopez, who was one of the main instrumental figures in that coup, who is heralded as an MLK type person here in the U.S. press. Any other country, that person would have been in jail to this day. So you hear the mantra, that, all the opposition banned from running. No, people who were instrumental in carrying out like illegal military coups to usurp democratic processes in the country. I don't think anyone else of a U.S. ally would actually stand for that. But to your point about the election, yes, we're talking about another election, right, with another sweeping victory from the PSUV, where Maduro won overwhelmingly. I mean, he won with almost 6 million votes. Even if what these people are saying is true, right, that there was some fraud, which I absolutely am going to get into that in a second, how that's not actually possible. But even if that were true, he still would probably have overwhelmingly won if you remove 1 million of those votes, because he won, I think, 3 million more than the next guy. But when you're talking about the actual elections themselves, like you said, Jimmy Carter Center has heralded them as one of the most transparent in the world. Every vote is auditable. Maduro himself has come out to dispel the fears, like this happens after every election. The opposition says it's fraudulent. The U.S., preemptively, outrageously said they weren't going to recognize the results of the election. But yes, every vote is done in secret. It's a secret ballot. You have to prove your identity, and it's audited. That's actually way more transparent than the U.S., amazingly. So all of this talk about fraud and the elections are fake, that's completely erroneous. Like you said, there's tons of international observers that are on the ground looking at these polling stations, talking to people, and again, the votes can be audited. So I don't understand even where this charge comes from when it's just debunked time and again. They just want to seize a narrative and just discount the elections because they obviously can't win a Democratic victory. And it's amazing to me because the opposition, told everyone to boycott, right? They didn't want to run a candidate. They wanted it both ways. They threw their weight behind Falcone, but then they were also telling people, don't vote, don't go out to vote. So then, of course, the vast majority of people who are going to go out to vote, again, in the poor working class areas, you saw a lot of abstentions in the higher upper middle class, whiter areas, because we know there's a large class struggle. That's the nature of this political crisis. And the people who showed up overwhelmingly to vote obviously were pro-Maduro supporters, obviously were Chavistas. So why is that surprising? Why everyone's saying, oh, well, it's fraudulent. All these people were fake. It's like, well, of course the majority was going to be Maduro supporters because the opposition boycotted the democratic process like it does every time. And you can't have it both ways.
And I think that really, I saw some parallels between what the opposition did in Venezuela and sort of what the Democrats are doing within the U.S., where they're already kind of planning to lose. I think the opposition in Venezuela knows they're going to lose. So many of the corporate Democrats, or as we call them, Democrats, also knew that they really are not going to change any of their policies in order to win over any voters. So they're already expecting kind of these low turnouts. But the Democrats here have already kind of preemptively blamed everything on Russia. They're expecting to lose so that when they do lose, they're going to say Russia influenced our election, et cetera, et cetera. The kind of far right-wing opposition knew that they were going to lose, I think, spectacularly. And so would rather try and cast the whole process into doubt rather than face the fact that basically they are more unpopular than they have ever been in the country.
And I think that's exactly the point, is that, I don't think that this is really, this doesn't exemplify maybe the support that Maduro has as much as it exemplifies the opposition to the opposition, if that makes sense. I mean, they're basically what people are saying and who have come out in droves to support this revolutionary process, from the Constituent Assembly, where they tried to redraft the Constitution to protect the revolutionary gains over the last 20 years, to this election, to support the process, to say, we want to protect these gains, right? We're talking about 1.5 free homes for the poor that are facing mass privatization and takeover from this neoliberal fire sale that would undoubtedly open if the opposition did take hold of the entire country. I mean, extreme poverty alleviated. It's undeniable that Venezuela does have one of the lowest inequality rates in the entire hemisphere, the lowest rate of homelessness. So there's certain advances that I think the majority of poor, working-class, indigenous, Afro-Venezuelans know they will lose. This is a huge, huge pivotal moment for them where they cannot give up those gains that they've gotten. Falcone was saying that he wanted to change the bolivar to the U.S. dollar. He wanted to dollarize the economy. We know what happened in Ecuador when that happened. It was a complete collapse. Banks were on fire. People smashing ATMs. He also is going to beg for the U.S. to help with aid, basically just begging for foreign intervention, and that's what the opposition likes to do, to create these international outcries and kind of humanitarian crises, so then they can plead for the U.S. to have foreign-backed regime change and overthrow democratically elected leadership. It's the same tactic again and again, but I think what the media leaves out of every single time that I see anything covered about Venezuela is that Chavismo is an undeniable political force. It's a movement. It represents the feelings and the lives of tens of millions of people. I see these absurd tropes that, they're just given a bag of clap food and then they have a gun to their head saying, vote for the government. I mean, it's offensive to tell tens of millions of people who are basically active participants. They don't just go out and vote every 2 years. They are active participants in this process. I mean, you talk to people on the streets in these barrios, they know more about U.S. imperialism than anyone in the U.S. that I talk to. They are so astute and so politically conscious because they've lived through this. They remember what it was like before Chavez won. They remember that dictatorship where actually that that massacre where I think thousands of people were actually just slayed by police in the street who were protesting this neoliberalism, this austerity that happened. So they don't want to see the country go down that road again. They've been there before. They know what's at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like we have a couple minutes left. I was wondering if you could go into, what actually at this point is at stake for Maduro. What are the potential, points of fallout from, I guess I'm sure the U.S. is considering additional sanctions. I'm sure there are European countries considering additional sanctions, whatever that might do. The prospect of regime change, again, kind of U.S. forced regime change is always on the table. And of course, during all of this, the PSUV under the leadership of Maduro is trying to bring some sort of economic stability to the country. So what is the situation, the economic situation, the political situation in Venezuela currently, and what obstacles do you think they intend to face and really have to face at this moment with regard to something like inflation or food stability, whatnot?
I mean, that's going to be a huge thing. I think that, it's really complicated in terms of the economy, and there is an economic war undoubtedly going on. I mean, that's why, you see shortages of just specific items. For example, toilet paper is missing, but then you can find paper towels and napkins, produced by essentially made by the same thing. So why is it that toilet paper is missing in mass, but these other products aren't? So there's this very strange thing going on when you see private companies who are charged with hoarding and all the black market food stuffing and crossing the border. But so all that aside, I mean, yes, Maduro is going to have to really, really deal with the inflation, with the economic crisis, and he's going to have to make some really serious decisions. And he also is going to have to reach out to the opposition, to the more moderate members of the opposition. And luckily, Brian, this time, I mean, we saw last time there in the Constituent Assembly, there was a sustained campaign from the opposition, basically, again, Leopoldo Lopez, one of these main figures who was stoking the flames of these Guarimba, these fascist fronts of the protests who were attacking polling centers during the Constituent Assembly, executing actual Chavista candidates. So again, just a completely undemocratic, totalitarian means to seize power and refusing to take part in this process. So it's going to be really difficult to mend bridges with this kind of more violent wing who are willing to go to very extreme lengths, right, to create an international outcry again and to get U.S. aid. And a lot of these people are trained from Colombia. We know the investment from the U.S. in Colombia over the past 10 years, we're talking about $10 billion, the paramilitary death squad. So a lot of, the border is more porous than we think. And none of this happens in a vacuum. Maduro has a very long road ahead of him and a very difficult task because, it's so polarized. It really is polarized where you talk to one person on the street and they're living in a completely different reality than a person down the street. And that's going to take a lot of initiative to bridge these gaps, to mend the fences. But again, I mean, how do you reason with an opposition who are just willing and ready to basically undemocratically seize power in terms of military coup and encouraging fascist violence constantly? So I don't know what's going to happen. But again, Maduro is saying he's calling for a peace dialogue. He's trying to pass these measures to protect the gains. But yeah, I mean, the good thing is he won, and the good thing is that those gains are going to be protected for a couple more years. But if the economy is not fixed and if initiatives are not taken to actually sustain and stop relying on imports and really kind of garner an actual feasible economy here, I have a bad feeling about the future, Brian. So we're optimistic right now, but we're looking ahead, and we just hope that the PSUV can really unite a front to sustain the movement and sustain that power.
Yeah, a lot of really great thoughts there. We are going to have to leave it there. We have been speaking with Abby Martin on this episode of People's Republic. She's the host of the Empire Files on Telesur and co-founder of the citizen journalism project Media Roots. You are listening to People's Republic. You can find more of our show, more news and analysis at People on Twitter and Facebook at People's Radio ATX. And you can also find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are potted. Stay tuned. This week, we are talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston, about his 2014 book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. Rather than begin the story of the American Revolution in the late 1700s, Dr. Horne examines the colonial history of a century earlier, asserting that the independence movement of the American colonies grew largely out of an attempt to preserve slavery for the white landowning ruling class. The result of American independence can thus be seen not as a major leap forward for democracy, but as a world historic defeat at the time for African and indigenous peoples. We are joined by Dr. Horne now to discuss his work. Thank you, Dr. Horne, for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Was that a fairly good assessment of the takeaways from the book, or is there anything there you would like to critique from that?
No, I think that was a fair summary and assessment. Let me say that since that book was published in 2014, I published something that might be called a prequel to that book. I'm speaking of The Apocalypse of Settler-Colonialism, the Roots of Slavery, Supremacy and Capitalism in 17th century North America and the Caribbean. And in that book, I take the story back to the early 1600s. So now we're almost 200 years before 1776. And in that book, what I basically try to suggest is that at the beginning of the 17th century, that is saying the early 1600s, England was a fringe player on the outskirts of Western Europe. All you have to do is look at your map and recognize that the rising power was Spain in the first place, which at that time was involved in a conflict with the Dutch, in which the Dutch, in a certain sense, emerged triumphant. But by the end of the 1600s, England was a major power on its way rather quickly to superpower status, a status that then, in a certain sense, was bestowed upon its revolting colonies in North America, now known as the United States of America, which has carried that status on into the 21st century, although there is evidence to suggest that that reigning superpower status may be coming to a lurching halt in the 21st century. And anyway, the answer to the question as to how and why London was able to catapult itself into the front ranks was basically slavery. That is to say that London became a leader of the international African slave trade. It also became a leader in terms of dispossessing the indigenous population of North America in particular, and then selling that indigenous population into slavery, be it in the Caribbean or be it as far away as the slave markets of Ottoman Turkey or of East Africa. That is to say, you can find Native American DNA all over the world, not least because of the depredations committed by Englishmen. Now, the turning point in that story that's told in the predecessor volume, The Apocalypse of Settler-Colonialism, comes in 1655 when London administers a devastating blow to the Spanish Empire by ousting the Spanish from Jamaica, which simultaneously not only delivers a blow to the pretensions of Spain, but also opens up more land for settlers and also for enslaved Africans to produce sugar. Sugar, as you know, was not only a sweetener for tea and coffee, but was seen in some circles as a miracle drug, if not a marker of sophistication. And so with the sugar boom, which was propelled by the forced labor of enslaved Africans, you saw not only money pouring into the coffers of London, but also you saw more Africans being enslaved, which simultaneously gave a boost, a turbocharged boost to the African slave trade. And from that point, you can see the takeoff of the African slave trade. By 1664, with the money developed from the sugar boom, London had been able to develop a stronger navy from which it was able to oust the Dutch from what is now New York City and a good deal of what are now the North Atlantic states of the United States of America. By 1672, London had organized the Royal African Company to systematize the African slave trade under the thumb of the monarch, and keep that thought firmly in mind because it will shortly change. By 1683, London had another advantage because the Ottoman Turks had been stopped at the gates of Vienna, and it seemed to be their inevitable sweep westward was halted, leading to a decline of that particular empire. Recall that in sailing southward to enchain and ensnare Africans from ports such as Liverpool and Bristol, Englishmen ran the risk of being enslaved themselves off the coast of North Africa, which was then ruled by the Ottoman Turks. But with the 1683 defeat, that became less likely, which gave another boost to the African slave trade. And then by 1688, you saw the so-called Glorious Revolution in London, in England, whereby the wings of the monarch were clipped, leading to the figurehead status that Queen Elizabeth now enjoys today. And not only that, but the monopoly that the monarch had over the slave trade dissolved, as the rising merchant class was able to elbow its way in to this lucrative trade, one of the most profitable enterprises known to humankind, where one can invest $1 and get $1,700 back. The deregulation of the African slave trade, leading to what I call free trade in Africans, then leads to a gigantic leap forward of the African slave trade. But the problem is that these Africans were pouring into the Caribbean, Jamaica and Barbados in the first place, where they oftentimes outnumber the Europeans 9-1 and some precincts 20-1. And that leads to a great trek to the North American mainland, where it was felt that conditions were much more favorable for slavery and foiling slave revolts. South Carolina, organized fundamentally in 1670, was basically a colony of Barbados. But even arriving on the North American mainland did not prevent the Africans from rebelling. You had a major revolt in New York City in 1712, a major revolt in South Carolina in 1739, another revolt in New York City in 1741. And so finally what happens, to bring us to the book that we started this conversation with, the Counter-Revolution of 1776, London decides to erode the potency of the European powers that had been aiding the Africans in rebelling against the Union Jack. I'm speaking of the Spanish and what used to be called Spanish Florida, and the French in Quebec. That leads in 1756 to 1763, the so-called 7 Years' War, where Spain and France are defeated, a world historic defeat, I should also say, for Africans and the indigenous population, because what happens then is that London goes to the settlers in Virginia, in Massachusetts, in New York, etc., and saying that this war was fought for your benefit, and so therefore cough up some taxes to pay for this war. And of course, the settlers did not want to do that. And that leads the settlers, in fact, to cut a deal with the French and with the Spanish against London. And it was with that assistance that the 1776 war was launched that led to the formation of the United States of America. Now, a couple more details. One is that London also in 1763 had issued the Royal Proclamation, which had sought to restrain the settlers, led by real estate speculator number one, George Washington, from moving westward, seizing the land of the Native Americans, and then stocking that land with the free labor of enslaved Africans. George Washington and his comrades, fellow slave owners, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, et al., objected to the Royal Proclamation, just as they objected to Somerset's case in 1772, which abolished slavery in England. It was thought that that decision would leapfrog the Atlantic, thereby jeopardizing these massive fortunes in the bodies of enslaved Africans. And that leads to this so-called anti-colonial war of 1776, leading to formation of the United States of America. And then to go on, you know that by 1790, or the 1790s, the United States, the newly born country, had ousted the British from the leadership of the African slave trade, not least to Cuba, which was then a Spanish possession, and by the 1840s were controlling the African slave trade to the biggest market, which was Brazil. That's talked about in my book, The Deepest South, United States, Brazil, and the African Slave Trade. Just like the story of Cuba is talked about in my book, Race to Revolution, the United States and Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow. But the turning point in terms of the abolition of slavery, of course, was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. Talked about in my book, Confronting Black Jacobins, the United States, the Haitian Revolution, the Origins of the Dominican Republic. The Haitian Revolution led to a general crisis of the entire slave system, which could only be resolved with its collapse. It forced London to move to end its relationship to the African slave trade by 1807, then nudged the United States to do the same by 1808, entered into a de facto alliance with the Haitians, which then put further pressure on the United States. In fact, when your own Texas seceded from Mexico in 1836, not least because Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston and the boys wanted to foil Mexico's attempt to abolish slavery, which they did in the 1820s under the leadership of Vicente Guerrero, a leader of African descent in Mexico 180 years before the election of Barack Hussein Obama in 2008. Sam Houston and company revolted and seceded to set up another independent country, not unlike the United States in 1776, but couldn't withstand the pressure placed on it by London and by their Haitian comrades. And so by 1845, Texas crawled into the Union to get back up to foil Haiti and Britain. And of course, Texas is still part of the United States of America as we speak.
Before, when you've talked about the Confederate Rebellion, you've said that they believe themselves to be the true heirs to the U.S. project, to the United States, those who most represent the kind of U.S. ideology. And I think you basically had kind of agreed with that in some sense, that to the degree that there's a core U.S. ideology that slave owning, that Confederacy would probably be it. Is that kind of correct, or?
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at the current issue of the American Historical Review, which, as you know, is the leading historical journal in this country, you'll find a short piece that I wrote where I try to connect 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, which I suggest was animated by the desire of the merchants to elbow their way into the African slave trade, 1776, whereby I argue that was driven by fear that the mother country, London, would abolish slavery, jeopardizing fortunes in African bodies. 1836, where I argue that Texas also seceded from Mexico, not least because of Mexico's turn towards abolition of the 1820s. And then 1861, when the so-called Confederate States of America, joined by Texas, then sought to secede from the United States. And the reason I argue in books whereby that latter secession did not succeed, unlike 1836, at least temporarily, and 1776, perhaps temporarily, was because the international situation had changed. That is to say that abolitionist Britain was feeling its oats. The United States, the Lincoln government, that is to say, was then aided by Haiti, which turned away Confederate ships from its ports. Unlike, for example, a Spanish Cuba. Cuba, of course, was a slave-owning society up until the 1880s. And that changed international situation helped to guarantee that the Confederate States of America, so-called, would go down in flames. I think the burden is upon those who disagree with me to explain how and why it is in 2018 you have this rather unfortunate chain of events involving black people, be it being shot by the police, Sandra Bland in Prairie View, or Philando Castile in Minnesota, or Eric Garner being strangled in Staten Island, or being turned away from Starbucks, or being, a young black woman in her dorm in Yale, police being called on her to have her rousted. or in Oakland just a few weeks ago, a young woman defined as white trying to call the police on black people barbecuing in a public park. People need to try to explain the deeper explanation for this continuing persecution of black people in particular. And I think that it's not enough to just say racism, although racism is a factor, but other societies have racism but do not have as profound a persecution of black people as the United States of America. In fact, I did a book on Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, some years ago. You may recall that from the 1890s up until 1965, or 1980 actually, Rhodesia was a settler colony. In fact, when the white minority regime seceded from London in 1965, they claimed they were walking in the footsteps of 1776. And there was only a European population of about 250,000 and an African population of about 8 million. So they were grossly outnumbered, not unlike the Caribbean. And yet, the Europeans in what was then Rhodesia used to shake their heads in wonderment at the United States and the epidemic of lynching. That is to say, hanging black people from trees without due process of law, saying, why do you have to reduce yourself to that level? They were asking themselves that question in the 1950s and in the 1940s, more specifically. And I think we should ask ourselves that question today. And sadly and unfortunately, many of our scholars have abdicated their responsibility, have refused to dig more deeply. And I think that that's one of the many reasons why we're now stuck with Agent Orange in the Oval Office, who bids fair to plunge this country into an unimaginable crisis and perhaps take the entire planet down with us.
So much of Donald Trump is not really that different than I think what we've seen. I have seen the argument made that essentially the reason so much of the U.S. ruling class, for instance, hates Donald Trump is not because of his racism, his bigotry, although those are things that exist with him, but in fact that he is simply not the most kind of fit to manage the affairs in common of the U.S. ruling class, of the bourgeoisie class. Wondering though what that says, because I feel like he represents in many ways a strain of settler-colonialism that is in fact entirely in line with so much of the kind of rebellious and almost apocalyptic nature of a certain settler-colonial mindset that he represents, to me, so much of what the U.S. is founded on. So much of the very core ideology of the U.S. is Donald Trump. He's not something foreign to that.
I'm afraid to say that you're largely correct, and I congratulate you on the perceptiveness of your analysis. Donald J. Trump, as I suggest in my book, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, in many ways represents the essence of settler colonialism. Not only Donald J. Trump personally, but the class forces that are lined up behind Donald J. Trump. Keep in mind that Donald J. Trump got 63 million votes. Keep in mind that he was supported by a cross-class coalition of those defined as white, not only billionaires like Robert Mercer, but those who are not billionaires, like, for example, in Dixie, where for about 50 to 60 years now in Mississippi and Alabama, through all times of changing times, you've had a Euro-American majority, sometimes voting 9-1, voting the same way, be it the white rich and the white poor. In 1991, in Louisiana, your neighboring state, David Duke, a Klansman and a Nazi, ran for governor on an explicitly racist platform and got 55% of the Euro-American vote. Only a massive turnout by black voters prevented a Nazi from taking office in 1991. And I think that those sorts of inconvenient truths oftentimes are very difficult for the U.S. left to deal with. The U.S. left oftentimes takes the position that they can't deal with inconvenient facts. What they'll say fundamentally is, I know what you're saying is accurate in practice. The question is it accurate in theory? That is to say, they have a theory of the case which does not admit the possibility that a Donald J. Trump can get tens of millions of votes from mostly those defined as white, which is one of the reasons why, for example, with the whole Russiagate scandal, and by the way, I'm interested in following the money with regard to Michael Cohen getting paid off by Ukrainian billionaires and millionaires and perhaps passing on some of that money to Donald J. Trump. But at the end of the day, if you're taking the position that Russia put Donald Trump in office, which some of my friends on the left do, then how do you explain the fact that black women who also use the internet and Facebook and Twitter, they voted against Donald J. Trump 9-1? Nobody ever talks about that particular issue. That is to say, why were such a considerable sector of the electorate, particularly those defined as white, were so susceptible, allegedly, to the machinations, we are told, of Vladimir Putin. And so this kind of inadequate analyzing, totally unlike, by the way, your perceptive comments of a few moments ago, it's putting us all on the fast track to perilous endangerment.
I'd like to continue, though, on that thread of settler-colonialism. So we had a couple questions from listeners. One of our listeners asked how you see different strands of settler-colonialism reasserting itself in new ways in the 21st century, especially on the self-described left. A lot of American leftists bristle at the idea of the U.S. being a settler-colonial project to this day, and many, including self-professed communists, rely on the U.S. Constitution for their basis of whether it's quote-unquote freedom of speech, or some rely on the U.S. Constitution, the Second Amendment for gun rights or whatnot. Who do you see as kind of the current settlers in this day? What does the settler-colonial project look like? What are some of the forces driving it? And who are the people upholding the new strains of settler-colonialism?
Well, one of the more unfortunate aspects of the United States today is that, believe it or not, sometimes the liberals are to the left of radicals. I mean, that's mind-boggling and astonishing. I mean, for example, Michael Klarman, an endowed professor at Harvard Law School, has just published this book, The Framers' Coup, where he takes apart the U.S. Constitution, of course, pointing to its underlying rationale, which is protecting slavery and the slave trade and protecting the 1% of that era. And yet you have some of our friends on the left who consider themselves to be to the left politically of Michael Klarman, and an endowed chair at Harvard Law School, yet they defend the Constitution. Of course, they haven't done any research. I don't know where they get their ideas from. I guess it's pardon the expression, but I guess it's like religious belief. It's based on faith as opposed to research. And I said in my book on the apocalypse of settler colonialism, problem is that I have a book coming out on Southern Africa in the next few months, and it would be as if under apartheid, pre-1994 South Africa, you had those in the left in South Africa who said, well, the regime in Pretoria has done a fairly good job of meeting the needs of the white working class and the white middle class. And so Nelson Mandela, instead of leading an armed revolt against apartheid, needs to really just pay attention to the South African Constitution and let it work its magic. And if you look at the United States, obviously the United States, it was a settler colonial revolt, that is the formation of the United States, not unlike Rhodesia in 1965 or Algeria in the late 1950s. And the Constitution and the resultant regime was meant to prop up the interests of the Euro-American population. And one of the contributions, in quotes, of the United States was the acceleration, if not the creation, of this new identity politics of whiteness. That is to say, those who were warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, Greek versus Macedonian, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian, Protestant versus Catholic, sometimes Christian versus Jewish. All of a sudden, when they crossed the Atlantic, they assumed this new identity, this politicized identity of whiteness. And one of the reasons for that new identity politics was because this country, the United States, had a real problem dealing with rebellious and insurgent indigenous populations, and they needed a broader population base to subdue and subjugate those populations, whereby you had a so-called Bill of Rights that did not obviously apply to the Africans. It only applied to the so-called white minority, including a Second Amendment, which obviously did not apply to the Native Americans and the Africans. As a matter of fact, the whole project was to keep guns out of the hands of the Native Americans and the Africans, as represented, fast forward to 1967, when the Black Panther Party goes into the California state legislature armed, which was consonant with the law, which leads to even the National Rifle Association helping to endorse gun control to prevent that from happening. And then after the black people are disarmed and crushed, then they go back to their status quo, which of course leads to the Santa Fe, Texas massacre just committed and perpetrated a few days ago. So once again, I think that some of our friends on the left, they really haven't been thinking things. I think that to a large extent, they've been ensnared by the magic of white supremacy. They haven't thought that deeply. They obviously haven't read that deeply. I mean, for example, if you look once again at some of the liberal writers, think of Alan Taylor of the University of Virginia in his book, American Revolutions, it's much more critical of the formation of the United States than many of these people to the left of this liberal is. I mean, I think that in some ways, our friends on the left, they remind me of biologists who are still using textbooks from the early 1950s and haven't caught up with the literature on DNA, which means that they're going to be misled and misleading at best.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of really great thoughts there. So I want to ask one more question, and that's you have at this point gone through so much of the history of the Americas. You've really put out a lot of good studies at this point. We're talking about a 2014 book just 4 years ago, and I believe you've published something like 7 books since then. I want to I want to basically ask what sort of important connections, because you've drawn so many important connections between the struggles of oppressed peoples throughout the world and especially throughout the Americas. What sort of other recurring themes or surprising patterns have you recognized that might not be immediately apparent to those who have not kind of deeply studied this world history?
Well, I'll try to curb my tongue with this last question and not be so long-winded. To your listeners, I would make these points. One, I think that all of us have to be involved in study. We can't be like some of our friends on the left who feel that they know enough and therefore haven't kept up with what's going on, either domestically or globally. We have to be constant and perpetual students. And secondly, we have to be activists. We have to be constant and perpetual activists. We need to be going to meetings, organizing demonstrations, organizing tenants unions, students unions, working class unions. We need to be perpetual students and perpetual activists. That's the lesson I would leave with you today.
Thank you very much. We have been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston, about his 2014 book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. His latest book, the last to come out, was The Apocalypse of Settler-Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.